Hi there, Derek Gilman with the Green Flower Growers Quest. Today we're in Mendocino County, California to discuss connoisseurship with Mean Gene of Aficionado Seeds and Freeborn Selections. How you doing, Mr. Mean?
Good, man. Doing good.
All right. So yeah, one of my favorite subjects is cannabis connoisseurship. I think there's a lot of room for improvement and for recognition of cannabis connoisseurship, of the joys of consuming cannabis. Just focusing on the flavor, the effects, the process itself. So I just curious what your thoughts were on that.
For sure. I think it's a really cool plant because it has so many different dimensions. You can enjoy it in a lot of different ways. And there's a lot of little things over the years that I kind of figured out, like for ways to taste things or ways to smell things and enjoy them.
What I find is over time, with more experience to different varieties and strains, you begin to develop a connoisseur's palate. You begin to able to kind of recognize the flavors a bit more. That it's not just
taste,
singularly
yeah.
sweet, or it's
Yeah.
it's like, oh, that's a sour.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a sour, but I'm also noticing some skunkiness in there.
For sure.
I'm also noticing a little bit of this spice in there.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an acquired taste. When most people taste wine, if they don't have experience with wine, because I think with wine you really don't even need to know anything, or with weed you don't really need to know anything, but you need the experience to know what you enjoy. And then after a while, I remember smoking, and when I first started smoking, and I remember I had a couple friends who would look at me and they'd go, "What, does it taste bad? Why do you make that face when you smoke?" I'm like, "It does. You're just burning stuff, man. I don't like the taste." And they'd be like, "Oh, this one's tasty, or that one's not tasty." And I was like, "I don't know. It all tastes the same to me. I'm just trying to get high, And then at a certain point, I remember I had the old Northern Lights that we had, and I brought some, and I was probably 14, 13, and I was like, "Oh, I got a bud, and we smoked it, and my one buddy, I passed it to him, and he goes, "Wow, that's really tasty." And so I go, "Okay, well, here's a little benchmark. Let me see what he means. What's different about this than other stuff?" And I took a hit of it, and I blew it out, and I go, "Wow, this one doesn't taste bad to me. This one actually has a nice feeling to it. It has a nice mouth feel. It has a nice lung feel. It's kind of, when you blow it out, it's kind of steamy and rich." And I went, "My mouth actually tastes good right now. That's interesting. That's a good taste." And then I went, "Okay," so that was my little starter kit of flavor recognition, And
There's
so
many ways you can assess it. Like you just said, the lung feel. I've
Yeah.
never even considered that, the
Yeah.
lung feel, but absolutely,
yeah, because
certain
some
ones
stuff's
are more
hot and unpleasant, and some stuff, it feels like you just inhaled some beautiful steam,
Yeah, and certain varieties, you taste it on the intake
Yep.
and the outtake,
Yeah.
or sometimes it's just either or.
Yeah.
I'm
And
tasting
there's-
it when I'm blowing it out. I'm not tasting much, but I'm doing it on
Yeah.
the intake,
Yeah.
Or when I'm blowing it out, I can taste it.
Yeah.
And in my experience, the truly special herb is that stuff. You're tasting it on the intake and the outtake.
Yeah.
Or if you're smoking a joint, it has a certain flavor profile at the beginning of that joint, but as you're kind of smoking through it and you get near the end, it kind of evolves, and you kind of
Yeah.
have these really kind of certain, I don't know, more volatile terpene hits
Yep.
up front. You kind of get those lemons and such, but as it evolves down, maybe you start to get the the skunks or the spices.
Uh-huh. And then I've always thought, anything that you can smoke a joint of it and you can smoke it down a long ways until it's a little roach and it still tastes good.
Yes.
It's okay, that's a winner. That's good weed right there, because they're not all like that.
Or not even still taste good, but by the time you get with each successive hit, it gets a
something
little
different.
better, a little
Yeah.
different, and
Yeah,
even a
yeah.
little better, to
Yep.
the point to where you're down to that, burning
Yeah.
your fingertips because you can't wait to see what it's going to do
Yeah.
next,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and some stuff it's like it just tastes worse and worse every hit and harsher, and some stuff it's like starting to taste like chocolate now when it gets down, and you're like it's starting to
Yeah.
taste like coffee and chocolate and like the rich like malted things as opposed to burnt funky things. Like, oh, this tastes like burnt just nastiness, but instead it's like, no, this almost like burnt like caramelized, like in a good way.
What
That's
I
always neat.
find is with the average, the more commonplace cannabis that's out there, which is the majority in my opinion, that first half of the joint might be tasty or decent, but it's that second half and it just starts
It's
getting
a
really kind of
nasty
just
roach. And
right?
that's where a lot of times I think like bad feeding and bad drying and
Lack of
processing.
flushing.
Yeah,
Right?
it just starts to come. It just starts to be like, yeah, there it is. Now it's starting to. There's more and more of the resin built up, and you really are, it's not. The fire's not treating it good.
Yeah. So we're talking joints. That's my favorite way
Yeah.
to consume,
Yeah.
actually. Is that your favorite way to consume, or do you have a different technique? That's really...
Joints have been, since I was a teenager, joints have been for me the real trial of like, how is this flower? You can take a bong hit and, okay, you can get some of it and that's good, or smoke it in a bubbler. And I've always really liked, as long as I've had enough weed to do it, I've always liked to just barely burn it. As far as if it's in a bong or a pipe or whatever, I don't like to sit and smoke it once it's all blackened too long. And once I learned about vaporizing, then I started realizing, yeah, there's nothing in there. It's already been gone. Once
Yeah.
the weed turns black, you can vaporize it and it's still almost green and there's no THC left, or terpenes. So I realized, okay, so what we were doing where we were just singeing it and dumping it, that was like a primitive vaporizing, but it tastes really good
Sure.
on good weed. But so joints are really it, I think, and there's something just coming down to joints that's like a finer point about joints. People like to roll these big, huge, fat joints, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that I've noticed is that a fatter joint has a bigger cherry that's hotter, the coal on it. You're sucking all this heat through. It's basically vaping out all of the good flavors in the first few hits.
And that's something I've had this theory actually about that vaping effect.
Yeah.
That unique to all methods of consumption, of inhaling cannabis, I should say, that the joint, singularly, in my opinion, is a combination technique of both combusting and vaporizing.
Yeah, because the hot air, the heat as it's
Passing
moving through,
through.
it's burning part, but it's vaping the next part.
How is it not?
And that's, I think, how you're getting so much flavor, because you're actually smoking oil
All the way
when
through.
you're doing a joint, because it's like, okay, this I'm burning weed like a pipe, but right here it's actually vaping, and that's where you're getting that good stuff. And so what I've noticed is that when you roll a big fat joint, it might look cool and you might feel like, oh, I'm smoking a fatty and it's great, but if you really want to taste some weed, I prefer, and I know you know this, I prefer the Modianos, the clubs.
Yeah.
And what I like to do is, even if I just want to taste it and know how good it really is, sometimes I'll even take the papers and flip them sideways so that they're short, so that it's just a little short joint.
Gotcha.
And then I'll just roll up just a little bit of bud in that, and I've really noticed that the same as what the hot cherry does. If your weed is broken up too fine in a joint,
There's not enough
then-
airflow.
yeah, and you also, there's so much surface area exposed that when, you're going to have that roach resin coming through the joint. You're going to wind up with roach, what makes you give you roach finger, right?
Yeah.
It's funky. It's not a smell you like.
No.
So what happens is if you break up your weed too much,
Roach finger.
there'll be no pockets protected from the roach smell and the roach taste.
Gotcha.
That burnt, right? So what I've always noticed is that if you break your weed up a little bit more rough, and I like to do it by hand, I won't use grinders for joints. It ruins a joint for me if it's rolled with a grinder. So I'll break it up into little chunks, right?
Yeah.
That are maybe a quarter of the size of a pea,
Yeah.
basically like BB, like the size of a BB, right? And then I'll roll up a real little joint of that. And then when I smoke that, I'm really able to see, okay, how does this stuff smoke? And I really get a clear picture. Whereas if I break it up, because sometimes you're somewhere and your weed's real dry and you break it up and it all kind of turns almost powdery. As soon as you take that first hit might be good, but the rest of your joint is covered from every little tiny pocket in the whole weed is covered in roach oil.
Like you said, those air pockets I think are critical, and you're achieving that by just doing a chunkier starting product. You're not grinding it down so fine.
Yeah.
I achieve that by just not rolling it so tightly.
Yeah.
I do use a grinder,
Yeah.
but I don't over grind it. I only give it a couple quick twists, okay, to get it,
well, no,
keep it
and
kind of chunky.
that's a key too, yeah, and
right?
then that's
Not
okay,
just don't grind and grind and grind, but do a couple quick grinds. You keep that chunky.
You'll achieve the same thing. If
Yeah.
you do if you just do a little twist, boom, okay, well that works too, you know what I mean?
And that air and flavor thing. So again, one of my techniques for tasting it is I like to inhale maybe half as much as I could, of the smoke, and then chase it with some air afterwards.
Yep.
So it's
For sure.
and then inhaling some air, and then slowly letting it out, to really get the taste. I can taste it better,
For sure.
as opposed to, like when you really take that draw as much smoke. There's always that guy that's like,
I'll tell you what too, what happens
you're not tasting anything.
Yeah, and when you hit it really hard like that, and you keep it hitting, what happens is that cherry is getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter, and it's basically that the smoke passing through the joint is so hot that one guy who takes that hit, he might get a tasty hit, but he just vaped all the terps out of that whole joint with one hit because he got the cherry too hot.
So hot,
and
that
that's
the rest of
something
it...
like cigar connoisseurs, they're gonna be like, okay, you draw on it a certain way. You're not just going to sit there and go because you just ruined your cigar. And cigar smokers know that, and joint smokers don't think of it as much, but I'll tell you what, it's like you said, when somebody gets it and they hit it like that, like not only they're probably not going to get as good of experience, but if you hit the joint after them, or if it's you and you hit the joint after yourself, you're going to be like, oh man,
what happened
I
here?
harshed the joint. I put too much heat through it all at once,
Yeah.
So it's funny because there's a whole thing that goes along with smoking a joint.
There's art to smoking a joint. It turns out, right?
There is, man. It's all it all plays,
So rather than that one, long draw, and even if you only go like half as much, I also like to do little puffs.
That
I like
keeps
to do
the cherry from getting too hot, man.
just little puffs rather than that continuous draw. And it also, when I've noticed joints run, it's inevitably from somebody who takes that long, continuous draw.
It's just sucking the fire through the joint.
You ever wonder why maybe your joint is running, okay? Try puffing it and twisting it with each successive puff and not just doing that long, long draw, okay?
Right, slow it down a little.
Slow it down a little.
Take it easy. It ain't going nowhere.
Well, far out, Gene. That was fantastic.
Yeah,
I think we made some headway on the topic of connoisseurship and joint smoking.
Yeah, we all learned how to smoke a joint, maybe.
Right? I mean, that's the funny thing is I have so many friends I've smoked with for years. They've been smoking joints for years. But inevitably, like, I'll see them taking those really long draws. I'll have a guy that comes over, and whenever he comes over, my joints run.
Yeah.
And that's when I figured it out. I'm like, why
hoovering
my
your
joints only
joint.
run when this guy comes over, and they never run otherwise. And I started watching him and paying attention to the technique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a trip, man. It's, and then of course, hey, if it doesn't matter to you, it doesn't matter. Don't worry about it.
That as well.
If you want to know why sometimes you smoke a joint and you go, whoa, that joint was really tasty, there's things that play into it. Like with like I'm saying, like a lumpy joint, not a lumpy joint, but little chunks of weed. The thing is you get that kind of surface area, you get these pieces of weed that are stuck together where the outside of the weed is stuck to the outside of the weed. There's fresh resin in there that's protected against the heat and against the roachy oil that's traveling through. So as it passes through, when the heat finally hits it and burns it, it releases a flavor pocket. So you get these pockets of flavor, whereas when you grind it up too much, what happens is everything revealed
It's all
to the smoke.
exposed to
So
that
as soon
heat.
as you hit it, all that oil is just coating all of the weed in 1 or 2 hits. And so your joint is basically a roach right away. And I see people smoking, oh, I'm gonna roll a half pounder, you know? And I'm like, cool, roll the half pounder, but you're basically gonna have a 7 and 16, you know what I mean? You're gonna have a 7 ounce and 27 gram roach is what you're gonna have, you know?
Fantastic.
That's what happens with that stuff,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Well, I guess our conversation evolved from connoisseurship into the science of smoking a
Science
joint.
of smoking a joint. But,
Beautiful.
you know, we both could agree that if you're going to really connoisseur out on some flower, the joint, you know, that's where you're really, that's where you're really getting
selecting
it, right?
a good clean paper as well. If you're fortunate enough, or you want to research and find some clubs which are no longer being made, or another paper that I think a lot of people enjoy are those. What are those ones? The elements, I think I see people doing, or the raw sometimes.
Elements are good. I love the raws. Raws are really good papers.
Yeah.
I've always loved raws. I love raws because they're a little stiffer than elements. Elements are like so papery, they're kind of flimsy.
Slick. They're real.
They tend to get, like, if you have really oily weed and you roll long joints in them, they get like floppy, and then you're like left holding like a limp joint. You know what I mean? So I've always liked raws. Yeah, raws are great. And but the best paper is a club. Clubs are the best, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Gene, thanks so much for your input on this topic. I look forward to discussing connoisseurship with you some more in detail. Man. And until next time, thanks for digging in with us on the topic of joint science.